Have you ever felt like there's something ancient guiding your personality, something deeper than environment, beyond experience, almost encoded into your being? What if I told you it might be hiding in your blood? Not your DNA, not your health, but the symbolic meaning of your blood type, the pattern it represents, the archetype it echoes. You see, in the East, especially in Japan, there's a long-held belief that your blood type reveals your true nature, that it's a mirror of your personality, not a joke, not a horoscope, a serious cultural belief. It's called Ketsueki Geta, and while the West largely dismisses it, labeling it pseudoscience, something remarkable happens when you place it beside the work of Carl Jung. Because Jung didn't just study behavior, he studied the soul. He believed we are all shaped by archetypes, universal patterns that exist beneath the surface of culture, language, and identity. They're not roles you choose, they are roles that choose you. Warrior, sage, lover, rebel, the mother, the orphan, the trickster. These are psychic blueprints buried in what he called the collective unconscious, and according to Jung, we're not born empty, we're born with a map. So what happens when you match that inner map with something as biological and mysterious as blood? This isn't about literal science, this is symbolic language, myth, metaphor, psychology that touches the edge of the mystical. And when you look at blood type not as medical data, but as an archetypal signature, something stunning begins to emerge. Maybe you've felt it already. That pull toward perfection, that rage when things slip out of control, that strange sense that you were born with a destiny or a flaw, that your life has followed certain emotional rhythms you never quite chose. What if it's all connected? Because here's the truth, symbols don't have to be proven to be powerful, they just have to speak to something you already feel. Let's go deeper. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So let's make something conscious right now. Let's look at the 4 main blood types through the lens of archetype. Let's decode the psychic message your blood may have been whispering since the day you were born. Start with type A. In Japanese symbolism, type A people are known to be perfectionists, deeply loyal, emotionally restrained, sensitive to chaos. They're the ones who try to keep things in order. They feel a moral obligation to do things right, even when no one is watching, even when it's slowly killing them. Sound familiar? In Jungian terms, this aligns closely with the sage or the perfectionist archetype. The one who seeks wisdom, the one who fears disorder, the one who sacrifices spontaneity for control. These are the people who double-check everything, who replay conversations in their minds at night, who are haunted not by what happened, but by what might happen. But here's the shadow, because every archetype has a shadow. When the sage becomes rigid, they stop growing. When the perfectionist clings too tightly to control, they lose their vitality, their empathy becomes anxiety, their standards become walls, and underneath that order is often a silent panic. The fear that if they stop performing, they'll stop being worthy of love. If you're type A, maybe you felt that. The exhaustion that comes from constantly anticipating other people's needs, the invisible pressure to be flawless, the grief of never feeling like it's enough. Now let's shift, type B. In the Japanese model, B types are seen as curious, passionate, a little wild. They're the ones who refuse to be boxed in. They chase inspiration, they lose track of time. They don't just break rules, they forget rules exist. To some, they're selfish, to others, they're free. In Jungian psychology, this resonates with the explorer or the rebel archetype, the one who walks away from tradition, the one who values individuality over belonging. These people might seem chaotic, but that chaos is often the birthplace of creativity. They don't just think outside the box, they live outside it. But again, Here comes the shadow. The rebel, when unintegrated, becomes impulsive. The explorer becomes lost. They avoid responsibility. They sabotage stability. They chase high after high without ever grounding. Their gift becomes their curse. If you're type B, maybe you know this. That deep hunger for something more, that refusal to settle, that quiet guilt that whispers you've let people down, not because you don't care, but because you care in a way that doesn't fit into clean boxes. 2 types down, 2 more to go. Let's talk about type O. In Quetzalcoatl, type O individuals are viewed as leaders, confident, assertive, clear. They walk into a room and own the space without even trying. They're the kind of people others naturally follow. They're decisive, competitive and driven. This is the warrior archetype. The king, the queen, the one who acts, who takes risks, who protects what matters. Jung would have seen them as carrying strong animus energy, force, focus, direction. But strength has a cost, because when the warrior loses touch with their vulnerability, they become cold. When the leader forgets humility, they become tyrants. Type O personalities, when unbalanced, may become emotionally avoidant, overly dominant, addicted to winning. Maybe you've lived that. The pressure to lead, the resistance to asking for help, the fear of showing weakness. You've built an identity on strength, and yet there are days when the weight of it makes you want to disappear. And finally, we arrive at the rarest, type AB. In Japan, AB types are considered enigmatic, rational yet emotional, logical yet intuitive. They're often misunderstood. They're not easy to read. They operate on a wavelength most people don't even tune into. Jung would call this the mystic, the observer, the archetype that walks between worlds. These people often carry both masculine and feminine energies. They're hybrids. They see things others miss. But sometimes they feel too much and trust too little. Their shadow is fragmentation, isolation, a deep inner conflict between opposing forces. The mystic, when disconnected, becomes unreachable. Their wisdom becomes loneliness. Their complexity becomes confusion. If you're type AB, you may have grown up feeling like no one really gets you. Like you're too much and not enough. Like you're watching life happen from a distance, even when you're right in the middle of it. But here's the revelation. No blood type is better. No archetype is superior. Every type has its light. Every type has its darkness. What matters is what you do with the pattern you were given. Because maybe your blood doesn't define your destiny, but maybe, just maybe, it reveals the doorway to your individuation, to becoming whole, to remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. So let's say you've identified your blood type and glimpsed the symbolic archetype it represents. What now? What does it mean to live with this knowledge, to carry that archetype consciously instead of unconsciously? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes essential. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not about polishing the mask you show to the world. It's about peeling it off. It's about meeting the parts of you that you've ignored, denied, or rejected and bringing them into the light. Because your blood type might reflect your dominant archetype, but you are not meant to live only one role. You are not meant to be just the sage, the rebel, the warrior, or the mystic. You are meant to become whole. And wholeness means integrating the energies that feel foreign, uncomfortable, even threatening. The parts you've been told don't fit you. Let's take an example. If you're a type A, symbolically the sage or perfectionist, you probably pride yourself on being organized, responsible, thoughtful. But beneath that structure often lies buried rage, the kind that builds silently, the kind that comes from always being the one who holds it all together. Shadow work, for you, might mean embracing the chaos you've tried to suppress, letting yourself be messy, saying no without justification, screaming in a car just to hear your own voice unfiltered. It might mean calling in your inner rebel, the Type B archetype you were taught to fear. If you're Type B, the explorer or rebel, your growth may lie in stability, in discipline, in learning to show up not only when you feel like it, but when it matters. Your shadow isn't your wildness, it's your avoidance, the intimacy you resist, the stillness that terrifies you because it threatens to show you what's underneath all that motion. You might need the calm of the sage, the patience of Type A, and what if you're Type O, the warrior, the leader? Then maybe your shadow work means surrender, vulnerability, sitting still with a feeling you can't control, can't dominate, can't win against, listening instead of fixing, asking for help instead of giving orders, finding the courage not just to lead others, but to let someone lead you. And for Type AB, the mystic, individuation often means grounding, learning to trust the simplicity of the moment, letting go of the constant analysis, the self-protection, the habit of watching life instead of fully living it. You might have to reclaim the energy of the warrior, the fire, the yes that doesn't need to be perfect. Because here's the truth. Whatever archetype you naturally embody, your unconscious will draw you toward its opposite, not to torment you, but to complete you. This is what Jung meant when he said the path to wholeness lies through the shadow, not around it. Not by escaping it, but through it. Your dominant blood archetype is only one axis of your psyche. It tells a story, but the story only matters if you're willing to write the rest. And the rest is usually where the real transformation lives. Shadow work is uncomfortable by design. It asks you to hold a mirror to yourself and see what you've been running from. The envy you deny, the control you disguise as care, the desire you've buried under shame, the fear that if you stop playing your role, you'll disappear. But shadow work also gives you back your power, because what you own you can integrate. And what you integrate no longer controls you. So let's imagine for a moment that you start doing this work. You start recognizing the patterns your blood symbolically points to. You begin to spot the moments where your archetype shows up, not just in your strengths, but in your pain. You begin to understand that the rage you feel when things don't go to plan isn't just about control, it's about fear. You see how your avoidance of routine isn't freedom. It's rooted in the terror of failure. You realize that your need to be the strong one is killing your ability to be known, that your isolation isn't mystery, it's a survival strategy that has long outlived its usefulness. And something begins to shift. You don't stop being who you are, you just stop pretending that's all you are. You make room for complexity. You learn to honor your dominant archetype, but not worship it. Because the truth is, if you live only through one archetype, you will eventually collapse into it. You'll become rigid, unbalanced, predictable. You'll feel powerful on the outside and fragmented on the inside, and the people closest to you will feel it too. But when you start embracing your full psychic spectrum, when you explore the archetypes you've pushed away, you begin to access a deeper kind of freedom. A freedom that doesn't look like control, it looks like authenticity. It feels like peace. You stop chasing approval, you stop performing, you stop fighting yourself every time you feel something that doesn't fit your role. And in that moment, something ancient inside you exhales. Because you've stopped resisting who you are. You've stopped fighting the very nature of your psyche. You've stopped trying to rewrite your blood and instead started listening to the myth it was trying to tell. This is the essence of symbolic psychology. It doesn't care whether the blood-type personality theory is medically accurate. That's not the point. The point is what it awakens in you, what it reveals, what it mirrors, what it helps you see. Carl Jung once wrote, "The symbols of the self arise in the depths of the body." And that's the bridge. Blood isn't just physical, it's mythic. It's the red thread that runs through your lineage, your instinct, your ancestral memory. It pulses with something older than language. And now you've learned to hear it, not as fate, not as a limit, but as an invitation. So when you look at your blood type now, look again. Not with a scientific lens, but with a symbolic one. Ask yourself, what archetype have I lived? What archetype have I feared? And what part of me have I been waiting to reclaim? Because your blood type may not define your destiny, but it just might be the key to unlocking it. Let's go even deeper now, into the realm where symbols become stories and stories become mirrors. Because once you've uncovered the archetype most reflected in your blood type and started noticing how it plays out in your personality, the next question arises: what are you still hiding from yourself? It's not enough to name an archetype. It's not enough to spot a pattern. The real work begins when you dare to ask, what am I still blind to? What part of me have I unconsciously exiled? This is where projection enters the story. In Jungian psychology, projection is one of the most subtle and powerful forces in the unconscious. It's when you unconsciously assign your unclaimed traits, your denied emotions, your unwanted impulses, onto others. You don't say, I'm angry. You say, she's so aggressive. You don't say, I'm afraid of being average. You say, he's so full of himself. And the deeper the repression, the stronger the projection. Now think about how this relates to your archetypal blood pattern. If you're a type A, and your dominant archetype is the sage or perfectionist, you might project spontaneity and impulsiveness onto others. You judge them for being irresponsible, not realizing it's the part of you that longs for freedom, screaming through that judgment. If you're type B, the explorer, you might criticize structure or tradition, not because it's wrong, but because a part of you craves stability and you're terrified of becoming what you secretly envy, someone grounded. If you're type O, the leader, you might dismiss vulnerability in others as weakness, only to discover that your strength has become a cage. You may even ridicule sensitivity, not because it's useless, but because it's the one thing you were never allowed to be. And if you're type AB, the mystic, you might see others as too emotional or too simple, because you've hidden your own emotional depth beneath layers of analysis and detachment. But those very emotions, those simple truths, might be what your soul needs most to access. This is what Jung called the shadow. The parts of yourself you've banished from consciousness, and the more symbolic power an archetype holds, the more fiercely it casts its opposite into shadow. But what you reject externally often holds the medicine you need internally. So ask yourself this: who triggers you? What type of person do you instinctively dismiss, ridicule, or avoid? Is it the chaotic artist, the rigid planner, the bossy leader, the mysterious outsider? Now flip the lens. Ask not what's wrong with them, but what are they reflecting back to me? That is the heart of symbolic shadow work. It's not just about discovering who you are. It's about discovering who you refuse to be, and understanding why. Because the truth is, every archetype has a role in your psyche, even if it isn't your dominant blood pattern. Even if it feels foreign or threatening or just not you. Jung didn't believe in a singular, fixed identity. He believed the self, the true, whole self, was made up of all the opposites you've been taught to split apart. The goal of individuation isn't to become your blood archetype. It's to transcend it, to grow beyond identification, to reclaim the parts of yourself that your primary archetype cannot contain. And you do that by consciously invoking the opposite, not by faking it, but by integrating it. If you're naturally meticulous and anxious, you might start by making small conscious choices to embrace uncertainty. Let something be unfinished. Allow a plan to fail. Sit with the discomfort of not fixing everything and see what emerges. If you're naturally impulsive and avoidant, you might create rituals. Commit to showing up even when you don't feel like it. Explore the possibility that structure isn't a prison, it's a container for freedom. If you're naturally commanding and self-assured, practice silence. Not the silence of dominance, but the silence of listening. Stay with feelings that can't be solved. Admit when you're unsure. Let others lead. And if you're naturally distant and analytical, try embodiment. Dance, cry, speak without editing. Take a risk that isn't calculated. Let the unknown touch you without needing to understand it. Every time you do this, something shifts inside. You're no longer just playing a role, you're reclaiming your wholeness. You stop being a fragment and start becoming a soul. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the transcendent function, the psychological process that arises when opposites are brought together consciously. It's the psychic alchemy that happens when you allow your inner sage to meet your inner rebel, your inner warrior to kneel before your inner mystic, your logic to hold hands with your longing. It's not about choosing sides, it's about building a bridge. Because only through tension can the self be born. And now you might be asking, what does this actually do for my life? Everything. Because when you begin to integrate the full spectrum of your psyche, when you stop resisting and start honoring every voice within, you stop looking outside for validation, you stop being driven by unconscious forces, you stop repeating old wounds in new relationships, you start making choices that reflect the truth of who you are, not the trauma of who you were forced to be. You set boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect your energy. You love more deeply because you no longer need others to complete you. You forgive yourself, not just for your mistakes, but for the roles you played to survive. And you begin to see everyone else differently too. You recognize the sage hiding behind the anxiety. You see the rebel behind the flakiness. You feel the warrior behind the arrogance. You hear the mystic beneath the silence, and you no longer judge them for their masks, because you've taken off your own. This is why we explore blood types symbolically, not because they are facts, but because they are mirrors. And sometimes what we need most isn't another diagnosis. Sometimes what we need is a myth that helps us remember who we are. So if your blood could speak, not in words, but in images, in dreams, in archetypes, what would it say? What would it ask you to become? What would it beg you to stop running from? Because your blood has always known the way home. The only question is, will you listen? Let's return now to the metaphor of blood. Not as fluid, not as function, but as myth. Blood story, as a carrier of ancestral memory. Because when you think about it, blood isn't just personal, it's generational. You didn't choose your type, it was passed down. You inherited it. Just like you inherited patterns, just like you inherited wounds. And in Jungian psychology, this inheritance is more than DNA, it's psychic. It's the transmission of unresolved emotional truths from one generation to the next. It's the mythic imprint of everything your lineage couldn't say, couldn't feel, couldn't process. So now ask yourself, what part of your blood archetype feels ancient? What pattern keeps repeating itself not just in your life but in your family? Maybe you come from a line of sages. Type A energy, people who sacrificed themselves to keep the peace, who maintained order at all costs, who never expressed their needs and silently grew bitter. Maybe their legacy is one of control, perfection, quiet suffering. Or maybe your lineage is filled with rebels, type B, people who ran, who couldn't stay, who avoided responsibility, resisted rules, fought authority, and lived on their own terms. But at what cost? Maybe you inherited their freedom, but maybe you also inherited their loneliness. Maybe your blood carries the warrior line, type O leaders. Providers, fighters, people who carried everyone else but forgot to carry themselves, who wore armor so long they forgot what skin felt like. Maybe strength became a shield that no one dared question, and now you don't know how to be soft. Or maybe you come from mystics, type AB, dreamers, seers, people who lived in between, emotionally complex, often misunderstood. Maybe you grew up in a house where feelings were deep but unspoken. where no one quite knew how to connect, because everyone was trapped in their own inner world. These aren't just traits. These are legacies, and if you don't make them conscious, they will repeat, not because you want them to, but because that's how the unconscious works. It loops until it's seen. So what if your work, your real soul work, isn't to become something new, but to transform what was passed down to you, to take your inherited archetype and elevate it, mature it, integrate it, not reject it, not obey it blindly, but to bring it into conscious relationship, to speak what your mother couldn't say, to feel what your father couldn't express, to forgive what your blood remembers. This is the sacred role of the individual in Jungian psychology, to break the spell of repetition, to walk the path of individuation so that future generations don't have to carry what you refuse to face. Because every unintegrated archetype becomes a ghost, and you weren't born to haunt your own life, you were born to live it, with all the contradictions, with all the tensions, with all the messy truth that your dominant pattern was trying to protect you from. But now you're ready. You're ready to step beyond the myth you inherited and begin crafting a new one. One where you don't have to play just one part. One where the sage can rest, the rebel can belong, the warrior can cry, the mystic can be touched, and maybe, in that synthesis, you become something entirely new. Maybe this is what the alchemists meant when they said, solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine, break apart what's rigid, reconstruct what's real, use every piece, honor every phase. Because even if your blood type reflects one archetype more than others, your soul is not so easily categorized. It is vast, it is contradictory, it is layered with mythologies you haven't even named yet. Carl Jung taught that wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means integration, the ability to hold light and dark, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, strength and surrender, and to do so without splitting yourself into pieces. That's what your archetype invites you to begin. It shows you where your energy naturally flows, and then it dares you to balance it by facing what you've disowned. This is the edge where psychological truth meets symbolic power. It's why myths are still relevant, why archetypes still move us, why we find parts of ourselves in movies, in fairy tales, in ancient goddesses and wandering prophets, and flawed heroes. Because all of it lives inside us, and sometimes we need a story, a metaphor, to bring it out. So here's your story now. You were born with a code, a blood code, not to trap you, but to initiate you. You were given a dominant archetype, not as a label, but as a starting point, a doorway. Our thread, the question isn't, is it true? The question is, what does it reveal? What does your blood ask you to confront? What does it long for you to remember? What part of you is still hiding in the very traits you've dismissed or judged or feared? This is not a test. There's no right way to be, but there is a wrong way to live, and that is to live asleep. To follow your archetype blindly, to let it define your choices, to resist its shadow, to silence its opposite, to let it become your prison. You weren't born for that. You were born to wake up, to see clearly, to name the roles you've played and the ones you've avoided, to stop letting your blood dictate your fate and start letting it guide your integration, because the map is not the destination, the symbol is not the soul. It's just a lamp in the dark, a way to see where you are and where you might be afraid to go. But now you have light, you have the framework, you have a language that spans continents, Jungian archetypes from the West, blood symbolism from the East, and you have the courage to step into your story with your eyes wide open. So, walk it. Not like someone trying to fit a mold, but like someone becoming real. Let your sage be wise, but soft. Let your warrior protect, but also receive. Let your mystic drift, but stay grounded enough to love. That's the alchemy. That's the work. That's what it means to become a whole human being. And you don't need permission. Your blood has already invited you. The only question left is, will you say yes? So now you've seen it. The symbolic truth woven into your blood, the archetype etched into your instincts. And maybe you've started to recognize how these patterns have shaped your relationships, your fears, your gifts, and your shadow. But this isn't where the journey ends. This is where it begins. Because now the question becomes, how do you live this awareness? Not just in thought, not just in theory, but in your day-to-day life, in your conversations, in your reactions, in your choices. Because once you become aware of your archetype and its shadow, life doesn't get easier. It gets realer. You start to see yourself in motion. You hear the old scripts. You notice when your sage kicks in and tries to fix everything, when your rebel wants to escape, when your warrior pushes everyone away, when your mystic checks out. You start to recognize the crossroads, the places where you used to react on autopilot, the patterns that once felt like fate but now look like choice. And in those moments, you get to decide, do you repeat the pattern or do you rewrite it? That's the power of symbolic awareness. It gives you back the pen. You stop being a character in a script you didn't write, and you start becoming the author of your own psychic narrative. But be warned, this work is sacred, and sacred work is often lonely. When you stop living inside your dominant archetype, people get confused. They expect you to stay the same, to keep playing the role, to perform the version of you that served them. But you're no longer here to serve the pattern. You're here to transform it. You're here to embody the full range of your humanity, even the messy parts, especially the messy parts. And that means you'll need to grieve. You'll need to grieve the years you spent trying to be only one thing. The years you silenced your wildness, your anger, your softness, your needs, because they didn't fit the role. Because you thought you had to choose between being loved and being whole, but now you know that was never true. Love that requires you to split yourself is not love. Validation that depends on you being only what others want to see is not truth. And strength that denies vulnerability is not power, it's performance. So now you give yourself permission to be layered, to be contradictory, to be the sage who sometimes loses control, the rebel who craves routine, the warrior who needs to cry, the mystic who needs to be seen. You let yourself shift, you let yourself grow. You let yourself live outside the story you were assigned, because there is no freedom in archetypal purity, only in archetypal integration, and that's what Jung knew better than anyone. He didn't just map the unconscious to explain you, he mapped it to free you, to show you that the psyche is a living system, that every part has a place, that you're not here to become better, you're here to become whole. So take this truth and carry it, not like a burden, like a compass. Let it guide your shadow work, let it shape your self-reflection, let it inform your relationships. Not to label yourself, but to deepen your self-trust. Not to excuse your behavior, but to understand your roots. Not to predict your future, but to walk into it with eyes wide open. Because your blood isn't your destiny, it's your myth. And you are the one who decides how the story ends. So, if you've ever felt misunderstood, if you've ever wondered why you react the way you do, if you've ever struggled with parts of yourself that don't seem to belong, this is your invitation to look inward, to listen to your blood, not as a verdict, but as a voice, to honor the archetype, but not idolize it, to explore the opposite, but not fear it, to walk the path of individuation, not as a destination, but as a sacred because the more you integrate, the less you need to explain. The more you own your story, the less power it has to control you, and the more you accept your wholeness, the more others begin to feel safe doing the same. That's the ripple effect of symbolic truth. You don't just heal yourself, you give permission for others to begin. So here's the final question, maybe the only one that matters now. What archetype is ready to awaken within you? Not the one you know, the one you've resisted, the one you've judged, the one you've secretly longed to embody, because that's where the treasure is buried. And now, you have the map.